Today on the Burning Archive, we are moving from our brief history civilizations to return to commenting on the Ukraine-Russia war. In March of this year, 2022, the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, said the war against Russia put the whole of civilization at stake. And his rhetoric has been repeated by many Western commentators. And so, is Russia the barbarians at the gates? Is it fair to describe, as many Ukrainian nationalists do, Russians as orcs? And what will happen to Western civilization if Russia wins the war? That is the question on today's Burning Archive. So welcome everyone to this episode of the Burning Archive. I am Jeff Rich. I am a writer, historian and very minor government official. And this podcast is the Burning Archive podcast. It's about all things history and culture, where we explore how the past is not dead. The past is not even past, and how by thinking about the past we can live better in the present. So I had this idea for the show while doing my series of episodes, 4 episodes on the concept of civilizations over the last 4 episodes. So that's episode 58, 57, 56 and 55, exploring the idea of the cradle of civilizations and how there have been many different types of civilizations around the world, and the very peculiar ideas around the particular kind of civilization known as Western civilization, based around the Atlantic or Anglo-American powers in the 20th and 21st centuries. And this concept of the Western civilization has been getting quite a run in a recent discussion of the Russia-Ukraine war. So now that there's no longer an election in Australia, I thought I would just come back to comment from a historical perspective on the Russia-Ukraine war, and in particular this sort of idea that it's a bit of a clash of civilizations, a war for civilization, a war between a democratic civilization and a barbaric autocratic civilization. What particularly prompted it was reading Samuel Huntington's book, The Clash of Civilizations and the Remaking of World Order, which was initially published in 1986 and was, helped inform some of my discussion on the previous episodes on civilizations. But he also, in that book, really makes an argument that there is a civilizational world or state around Russia, and that is distinct from the West. And he also makes an argument that there's a kind of Islamic civilization that is also distinct from the West, and I guess is bound to come into conflict with them. And he even has a particular sort of section in his book on what he calls fault line wars where these civilizational realms butt up against each other and, I guess compete for influence and domination. And Ukraine is very much one of those frontline wars. In fact, he has a very specific discussion about that whole issue, which I thought I would maybe just look into a little bit today to reflect on the value of this concept of civilization as applied to world affairs, and whether Samuel Huntington was right in any respects, and what perhaps we can learn from that given the current state of the military, economic, diplomatic and cultural conflict between Russia and Ukraine, or perhaps more accurately between Russia and NATO, or even between the West and the rest. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about kind of what Samuel Huntington said in Clash of Civilizations around the Orthodox civilization and its conflict with the West, and how that might emerge in a sort of fault line conflict in Ukraine, whether the developments in the war show whether he was right or wrong, or perhaps in what respects he was right and in what respects he was wrong. And then I guess I'm going to talk about the current state of the war as I assess it against the four main vectors that I discussed in my earlier episodes on the Ukraine war back in sort of March, April sort of time frame. And finally, whether we perhaps need to drop the cultural blinkers of Western civilization. Is the myth of the West collapsing, especially if Russia ends up winning the war in Ukraine? So Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations and the Remaking of World Order, his 1996 book, is an extraordinarily influential book, I guess, in the study of international affairs, and has been, I would say, probably quite influential on American foreign policy as well. Its 2011 edition includes a foreword by the grandfather of, I guess, current American foreign policy, imperial foreign policy, I almost said, Zbigniew Brzezinski. And there he says that, that is, Brzezinski says that Huntington's Clash of Civilizations is one of the absolutely top shelf books to both understand the contemporary world, but also to intelligently reshape that world. And Huntington's Clash of Civilizations has been referred to a bit in the current news around the Russia-Ukraine war, including his prediction that if his concept of civilization and civilizational zones really held, then war should not break out between Russia and Ukraine because they both belong to the sort of orthodox civilization. So some people have said, well, this war proves that Huntington's thesis was wrong, whereas some others have also said in some ways, well, to some degree they've echoed Huntington's rhetoric that the emerging conflicts in the world are clashes of civilization, and one of those is between Russia and the West. So let's have a closer look at what Samuel Huntington actually said in this book. And I would say, broadly, there's three sort of things he sort of said. So first of all, he really, specifically about Russia and Ukraine, I guess. In Clash of Civilizations, he's sort of using the idea of the West and of the separate orthodox zones to reinvent a role for NATO in the post-Cold War world. And we'll come back to that shortly. He's really sort of saying, well, that NATO should expand eastward and it should define its clear civilizational boundaries between the Orthodox world and the West, i.e. Europe and America, North America. And the second big thing he says is he, in a way, is a bit of a critic of the sort of Francis Fukuyama, unipolar moment, rules-based order, Western universalism, because he's really advocating a degree of modesty on the part of Western civilization to accept the continued existence of other civilizational states, Russia, China, Islam in a way, and use that to prevent war. And then finally, in relationship to Ukraine, he defines Ukraine as one of the fault line war zones, including places like in the Middle East and that sort of thing, and maybe parts of Africa as well. And he really foresees three scenarios of conflict between Russia and the West in this fault line zone. So let's just have a little bit of a closer look at those three broad ideas. So Samuel Huntington's book, Clash of Civilizations, is very much an attempt to kind of make intellectual sense of the new world order introduced by the end of the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the apparent breakdown, I guess, of ideological bipolarity or an ideological cleavage of the world between democratic and communist, or capitalist and communist states, East v West. Huntington observes that during the Cold War, the US was at the centre of what he describes a multi-civilizational grouping of countries known variously as the Free World, the West, or the Allies. And similarly, in a way, the communist states were comparable. It was a multi-civilizational grouping of countries more sympathetic to socialist ideology. But the breakdown of the Iron Curtain in Europe posed a particular problem, because where now, or how now, to make sense of the security and ideological and national and civilizational boundaries of Europe particularly. And this was a question of real debate. Should Russia be invited to join the European Union? Should one continue to talk about Eastern Europe, Central Europe, Western Europe? Should NATO be expanded? That sort of question was very much on the agenda. And as he says, the free world of the Cold War was being reconfigured into a new grouping more or less coextensive with Western civilization. A bounding process is underway involving the definition of the membership of Western international organizations. And so he said that establishing the clear line between what one might call Western civilization and something else, in his view, Orthodox civilization and Islam, was one of the crucial big geopolitical tasks of the 1990s and 2000s. Establishing a line in Europe, or redefining the line in Europe, or on the Eurasian continent, perhaps one could say, that defined what was the West and what was the rest. What is Europe? He asked. And where is Europe's eastern boundary? Who should be thought of as European, and hence as potential members of the European Union, NATO, and comparable organisations? And his answer, and it's an answer that we see stated repeatedly in the current discussions of Russia and Ukraine and the EU and NATO, was that the most compelling and pervasive answer to these questions is provided by the great historical line that has existed for centuries separating Western Christian peoples from Muslim and Orthodox peoples. This line dates back to the division of the Roman Empire in the 4th century and to the creation of the Holy Roman Empire in the 10th century. It has been in roughly its current place for at least 500 years. And it presents, and that is, it's the line that runs from the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania and Finland, down past Russia, Western Belarus, Ukraine, Romania and the sort of former Yugoslav republics. This, he felt, was the key defining answer and the critical question to pose. He said the term Eastern Europe should be reserved for those regions which developed under the aegis of the Orthodox Church. The identification of Europe with Western Christendom, Huntington wrote, provides a clear criterion for the admission of new members to Western organisations. So all those non-Orthodox states of the former Eastern Europe, or even part partly non-Orthodox states of the former Eastern Europe should join the EU. And similarly, they should define, he said, the logic of civilizations dictates a similar outcome concerning the expansion of NATO. He advocated the eastward expansion of NATO to include all the states up to Russia's borders, and hence criticised the early efforts of the Clinton administration, the very early tentative efforts of the Clinton administration to, I guess, incorporate Russia into the peace after the end of the Cold War and not divide Europe again. He said that this was a universalist approach that was inappropriate. But Huntington did set some limits. So he said that NATO expansion limited the countries historically part of Western Christendom, however, also guarantees to Russia that it would exclude Serbia, Bulgaria, Romania, Moldova, Belarus and Ukraine as long as Ukraine remained united. NATO expansion limited to Western states would also underline Russia's role as the core state of a separate Orthodox civilization, and hence a country which should be responsible for order within and along the boundaries of orthodoxy. So you can see in a way that he wasn't like a blunt advocate of a unipolar America domination of the world sort of perspective. He wanted to say that there are sensible boundary lines between Russia and the West, and that Russia should have, I guess, if you like, a civilizational sphere of influence that should be recognized by the West and acknowledged by the West. And so he was not an advocate, as at that stage in the 1990s John Mearsheimer was, for example, of putting nuclear weapons on the boundaries of Ukraine to target Russia. Rather, he wanted some sort of understanding of the objectives and approaches of the different civilizations of Russia and the West, so that there could be some peaceful and orderly arrangements, but nonetheless one that would strangely define the Orthodox Christian world as not part of European/Western civilization. And so his logic of civilizations ended getting him into quite strange and funny sort of arguments. There's the whole question of, well, is Russia part of Europe or not? It's a bit hard really to imagine Russian culture outside of Europe. And it's very much, if you like, perhaps better defined as a expansionist peripheral state of Europe, just as Spain was an expansionist peripheral state of Europe. And similarly, he says Greece is not part of Western civilization. Western civilization appears to have really been defined as the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant heritage of Anglo-America. But nevertheless, there is a lot in Huntington's approach that actually advocates some tempering of Western universalism and some modesty in its objectives in order to prevent conflict between the major civilizations. And this is where his predictions, his three scenarios about Ukraine come in, as I sort of briefly referred to from his text before. He said boundaries of NATO should not expand to Ukraine so long as Ukraine remains united. But he also recognised that Ukraine was very much a border state between Poland, Hungary, in a way, this sort of Turkic world, and the Russian world. And it was quite socially and culturally divided. And so it was very much a seedbed for the kind of fault line war that he predicted would become the flashpoints in world order, the places in the world where the great civilizations, sort of dominated by their core states, would come into conflict. So he made three specific predictions, or he predicted three potential scenarios for how the situation between Russia and Ukraine might develop. And each of these three scenarios were sort of premised on the idea that, and here I quote, overall, Russia is creating a bloc with an orthodox heartland under its leadership and a surrounding buffer of relatively weak Islamic states, which it will in varying degrees dominate, and from which it will attempt to exclude the influence of other powers. Russia also expects the world to accept and approve this system. Something perhaps of a somewhat limited understanding of the Russian state, but we'll let that pass for now. So then Huntington talks about how conflicts might emerge between Russia as the core state and its various sort of heartland fault line war zones. And for Russia, Ukraine was, he said, the most populous and most important former Soviet republic. And he briefly covered its history as referring to the Khmelnytsky rebellion in 1654, where a Cossack leader rebelled against Polish rule and swore allegiance to the Russian Tsar, which was perhaps one example of Ukrainian independence. He doesn't refer, of course, to the Khmelnytsky riots and mass massacres of tens of thousands of Jews in that period as well, but we'll just let that pass for now. But he does comment that the civilizational fault line between the West and Orthodoxy runs through its heart and has done so for centuries. At times in the past, Western Ukraine was part of Poland, Lithuania, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. A large portion of its population has been adherents of the Uniate Church, which practices Orthodox rites, but acknowledges the authority of the Pope. Historically, Western Ukrainians have spoken Ukrainian and have been strongly nationalist in their outlook. The people of Eastern Ukraine, their region we now know as Donbass and Lugansk, on the other hand, have been overwhelmingly Orthodox and have in large part spoken Russian. And this is a very basic, understanding of the fault lines, but it's a quite accurate, picture of the fault lines as well. I guess I would also comment, having done the extended series on civilizations, this is where it's important to think of civilizations as a process rather than a fixed entity. And I think this is partly where Samuel Huntington gets into trouble with some of his arguments, because he perhaps rather invents a civilizational fault line where one perhaps did not really exist, where there was a much more subtle intermingling of cultures that perhaps did not have to go to war with each other. He predicts, and even in the early 1990s, there were significant conflicts between Russia and Ukraine around both the process of separation from the Soviet Union and also questions of whether they should be loyal to Europe or loyal to Russia. And people were posing it as a sort of a cultural conflict. And he said that the development of relations between Ukraine and Russia, given these historical divisions and these cultural divisions and these civilizational fault lines, could develop in three ways. The first of those is that the important conflicts between Russia and Ukraine over Crimea, rights of Russians, the Black Sea Fleet and economic relations would not lead to armed conflict, because they would ultimately be settled within the confines, so to speak, of the Orthodox civilization that Russia and Ukraine shared. He said, if civilization is what counts, however, violence between Ukrainians and Russians is unlikely. These are two Slavic, primarily Orthodox peoples who have had close relationships for centuries and between whom intermarriage is common. despite highly contentious issues and the pressure of extreme nationalists on both sides, the leaders of both countries worked hard and largely successfully to moderate these disputes. And this particular comment, I have seen several commentators on Twitter and elsewhere bring out and quote from Huntington's book in the context of the Russia-Ukraine war, and as evidence that Huntington got it wrong. That is, if you like, if civilization is what counts, if his argument was that if civilization is what counts, therefore violence between Ukrainians and Russians is unlikely, then clearly civilization is not what counts so much, because violence between Ukrainians and Russians has flared up and indeed has been going on for at least 8 years. But that was only one of his predictions, perhaps the most rosy of them. The second one was that Ukraine could split along its fault line into two separate entities, the eastern of which would merge with Russia. He noted that there'd been several debates already in the early 1990s about the secession of Crimea, and that in 1992 the Crimean Parliament had voted to declare independence from Russia. And it was only after subsequent pressure that that was rescinded. And indeed he also quotes a Russian general saying Ukraine, or rather Eastern Ukraine, will come back in 5, 10 or 15 years. Western Ukraine can go to hell. So he imagined some sort of scenario in which conflict between the West and Russia deteriorated seriously and came to resemble those of the Cold War, in which case a rump uniate, as in Uniate Church, the sort of Catholic version of the Orthodox Church in Ukraine, a rump uniate and Western-oriented Ukraine would only be viable if it had strong and effective Western support. That is perhaps the most accurate of Samuel Huntington's predictions, tragically, and that appears to be how things may be developing. And then he said finally, the third and more likely scenario is that Ukraine will remain united, remain cleft, remain independent, and generally cooperate closely with Russia. Once the transition questions concerning nuclear weapons and military forces are resolved, the most serious longer-term issues will be economic, the resolution of which will be facilitated by a partially shared culture and close personal ties. The Russian-Ukrainian relationship is to Eastern Europe. John Morrison has pointed out what the Franco-German relationship is to Western Europe. Tragically, that is the scenario that did not happen. So Samuel Huntington made 3 predictions back in 1996. One, that Ukraine would cohere around its Orthodox civilizational world identity and be part of the Russian world. One, that Ukraine would split between the Russian and the Western, or the Orthodox and the Catholic/Protestant world, and there would be increasing Cold War between Russia and the West, and that appears to be the scenario that has happened. And thirdly, that Ukraine would remain a divided state, but would cooperate pragmatically between a sensible, tempered, diplomatically directed West and a sensible, economically oriented and diplomatic Russia. And that tragically is the path that leaders in both NATO and Russia have sadly not chosen. So Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations, you could say, almost predicted one of the scenarios that has developed in the Russia-Ukraine war. But he did so, I guess, using concepts like these sort of big civilizational identities, these civilizational states, that I think led him to make some mistakes, and that also by reinventing a role for NATO as the Western Protestant Catholic crusade against the Orthodox world and Islam has perhaps inspired overly aggressive diplomacy and overly aggressive economic policies from the West towards Russia, and so contributed to the conflict today. He, in the end, advocated the expansion of NATO. That was the root cause, as John Mearsheimer has argued, of the conflict between Ukraine and Russia. So that's Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations Revisited. Quite an interesting thing to go back sometimes and look at the predictions that prominent people make and compare them to how real events turn out. And something that very few people do, but I think something perhaps we should all do a little bit more of. Okay, so that's my sort of point at which I'm going to perhaps comment now about the current state of the war in Ukraine and ask if this has been a war for civilization. What if Russia wins? Now, of course, when I say that, I don't really see there being these, alien and distinct civilizational barriers between the West and Russia. I don't see Russia as not part of the civilized world, and I certainly don't see Western civilization as a terribly coherent concept to fight for. But I'm certainly using those terms a little bit ironically and with much more the understanding of Felipe Fernandez Ernesto. These are banners people are fighting under. They're not real descriptions of processes. But there is a war going on, and it does seem that things are not quite turning out the way leaders of NATO and America and the West were hoping back in February 2022. So I last commented on the Russia-Ukraine war in episode 51 on April 14, where I discussed the issue of war and peace in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, including responding to some great questions from a listener, Cody, on the argument that I'd been putting about the Russia-Ukraine war being, I guess, the culmination of a long frozen conflict between Russia and the Anglo-American world following the Cold War. And what I had been doing in a number of special episodes before then was looking at 4 vectors of the war: military conflict, the economic conflict, the diplomatic conflict, and the cultural information war conflict. And what I'm going to do in the remainder of this episode is briefly have a quick look at, well, what is the state of play today, and then ask the question of, well, what does it mean for people who espouse Western civilization if this war against Russia, if in this war against Russia, Western civilization fails? So let's first look at the military situation. And I'm recording this episode on the 27th of June 2022. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail in all of these things. There are now many programs and channels, some of which I would highly recommend people listen to or read or watch on the situation, including the military situation, etc., and the sort of world affairs situation in the Russia-Ukraine war. But I just briefly want to, and among those things are like the Duran, Alexander Mercouris, Alex Christoforou, there's the Russians with Attitude podcast, and there's many other really excellent pieces of coverage of the state of the situation. And of course, much propaganda from both sides, but some real facts on the ground emerging. And so I really just want to briefly look at each of my sort of 4 vectors and sort of look, so who has the advantage, so to speak, at this point in the conflict? And I would say that Ukraine is clearly losing the war militarily. The West has failed to destroy Russia's economy with its sanctions from hell, and may have even undermined its own economic institutions, its own economic order, and created havoc for the global south in terms of inducing shortages and price rises in key commodities, including things like food and energy. And then early NATO-Ukrainian dominance in, the cultural and diplomatic war has proven a little bit shallow and perhaps a unsustainable advance. And as more and more information comes forward about both some of the extremism in some of that commentary and the outright fake propaganda that has been included in stories like the Ghost of Kiev and other staged events, I think some of that early dominance in the cultural and diplomatic war is being exposed, is leading NATO, Ukraine, America into a rather exposed, vulnerable position diplomatically, where it is losing power and influence in much of the world, including India, China, Africa, South and Central America, and, the global South. So let's just quickly look at militarily. So as of today, Russia now controls the key city of Severodonetsk. It has control of, southern and eastern Ukraine, and is pushing hard against the heavily entrenched defensive positions around the city of Slavyansk and into the core part of eastern Ukraine. And there are widespread reports of mass desertions, poor morale, destroyed missiles, and problems in the Ukrainian defence forces. Many new weapons have been supplied by the West to Ukraine, and many of those weapons have been both destroyed or sold to the black market or captured by opposing forces. And in some cases, the Ukrainian forces have not been properly trained in their usage. And in other cases, the Ukrainian forces say the Western missiles didn't really do the job that they wanted. So there are many more detailed military analysts out there who are reporting the things, but clearly Russia is pushing strongly into Western Ukraine, reporting relatively few losses and controlling the battlefield quite successfully. Some people are saying that the Ukrainian resistance in eastern Ukraine is collapsing, and we will see how that will emerge over the coming weeks. But it certainly would seem that Russia is advancing its military objectives quite successfully in Ukraine. So on Vector 1, military, Russia is winning the war. On Vector 2, economy, now back when I was speaking in March and April about the Russia-Ukraine war, the West was launching its economic sanctions and threatening to turn the ruble into rubble and to punish Putin for his sins and make the Russian people suffer through the broad-scale economic sanctions from everything from Western companies like Facebook and McDonald's leaving Russia through to seizing the foreign reserves of the Russian government held in Western banks, hundreds of billions of those dollars, through to restrictions on exports of oil, gas, food and fertilizer, all those sorts of things. As we speak today, the Russian ruble is trading for approximately 53 rubles for $1 US. Now, at the outset of the war, I think it was around about 80, and at the lowest point, I think it went to about $1 for 120 rubles. And that was really in the first couple of weeks after the invasion. But Russia introduced a range of measures to protect its economy, and together with increased prices for the products that Russia sells, the Russian ruble has significantly strengthened now. In fact, if it's 53 rubles to 80, so that's about a 40% increase in value since the war of the Russian ruble compared to the US currency. So that's not the only measure, I guess, of the economic resilience of the Russian economy, but it certainly is a significant one. And similarly, Europe is having significant issues with what it's going to do with alternative supplies of gas and oil. And there is increasing discussion of the problems created for the world, particularly countries in Africa, about global food shortages due to restrictions on exchange of rubles to buy wheat and other food products in key African countries. Inflation in Russia is moderating. Indeed, people are even expecting price falls due to, overstocking in the sort of month or so after the initial invasion, and perhaps over panicky reactions. Whereas in many Western countries, inflation is increasing and becoming more problematic. So I guess Russia does not appear to be losing the economic war. Perhaps arguably the West's strongest strategic advantage over Russia was in the economy, and yet what appears to have happened is the conflict and maybe the overemphasis in the West on financial instruments as opposed to control of resources has led to a massive, I think, strategic miscalculation by Western leaders that they could destroy the Russian economy through sanctions and everyone could just put up with the consequences. In fact, what they've done is not destroy the Russian economy and created enormous collateral damage both within their own economies and in other parts of the world. So, on Vector 2, the economy, Russia seems to at least be holding its own. Let's call it a stalemate, if not a victory for Russia. Then let's look at the diplomatic war, and this to some degree flows out from that diplomatic or the diplomatic consequences of the economic sanctions applied by NATO and some of the Western countries against Russia. Just the other day, Volodymyr Zelensky gave a video address to the African Union, where 55 heads of state of African countries had been invited to listen to Volodymyr Zelensky speak about how fighting against Russia was protecting civilization. However, only 4, I've heard 2, maybe 4 of those 55 African heads of state actually attended the address from Zelensky. And similarly, there is growing separation, shall we say, growing interest in Southern American, African and Eurasian states in maintaining close relationships with Russia and not subscribing to the West's crusade against Russia. Some of the early diplomatic victories, I guess, of the West in terms of United Nations resolutions condemning the Russian invasion appear to have been a little bit shallow and a little bit coerced. Indeed, I listened to a very interesting podcast by the International Crisis Group, which is like a pretty pro-NATO international affairs organisation, and they had an interview with a former Finnish Prime Minister on their podcast called Hold the Fire. I do recommend this. The former Finnish Prime Minister was, The podcast is called Hold Your Fire, ! And the interview, and this was published on the, about the 24th of June, 23rd of June maybe, and they spoke with the former Finnish Prime Minister Alexander Stubb. So Alexander Stubb really acknowledged that the early diplomatic successes were a little bit soft, maybe through arm twisting and that sort of stuff, and increasingly the views of countries has been, well, this is not our war, and what you're doing in this, particularly with your economic sanctions, is you're actually hurting us, so please don't drag us into this war anymore. And Alexander Stubb kind of says that really the West needs to develop a somewhat more modest and less crusading style of diplomacy, where it can acknowledge these concerns and perhaps make some difficult choices in relationship to the war. There is even a growing sense, I think, in diplomatic circles like the International Crisis Group, that this war has not gone to plan in terms of the West's approach. I don't agree with a lot of the stuff that Alexander Stubb says. He's very much pro-Atlanticist kind of viewpoint, but it's quite an insightful interview. So if you do get a chance, and if you are interested in these sorts of issues, I'd recommend you listen to that particular episode of Hold the Fire by the International Crisis Group, where they interview Alexander Stubb, the former Prime Minister of Finland. So on the diplomatic war, I think, I guess Russia is probably drawing even, if not starting to overtake the West on that front, and even with growing divisions in within the EU and within NATO, between Turkey and Sweden, etc., Hungary and the other states, some of the cohesiveness of the West is likely to break down. And what's more, increasingly there is huge internal political conflict in Western countries that is going to make its current rather militant strategic position hard to sustain. So France has now got a divided parliament president situation. Germany is lurching towards political crisis. The United Kingdom's lurching towards political crisis. There's been political crises in Estonia and Bulgaria and Moldova, and so it's not a pretty sight for the EU and NATO countries, and of course America is descending into increased internal political conflict after recent Supreme Court decisions on both guns and abortion. So diplomatic war, I'd say it's at least a stalemate, but one in which the more patient party, who are Russia and China, are likely to prevail. Then finally, the information and culture war. And this, in a way, returns a little bit to the topic of Samuel Huntington's religion-based civilizational states. We've had the most extraordinary information and culture war, and I think for many of us who are, I guess, informed about multiple civilizations in the world and respectful of multiple civilizations in the world, some of the rhetoric about Western civilization and the barbarians of Russia has been truly distressing. Of course, everyone abhors violence and everyone abhors the sufferings of all the civilians and all the soldiers involved in the Russia-Ukraine war, not only those on the Ukrainian side. And it is nonetheless a strange thing that the absolute dominance of the Western media story about Ukraine and it's turning Volodymyr Zelensky into a hero does seem to be breaking down just a little bit. In part, the facts on the ground are simply no longer sustainable. In part, more and more is emerging about the inconsistencies between the conduct of the Ukrainian state and its claim to be part of European civilization, liberal democratic rules-based order. It has, after all, banned all opposition parties permanently. It has banned Russian language teaching in schools. It describes Russians as orcs. There's been human rights abuses and so on and so on. But perhaps most of all, I think one of the things I have noticed is that the extremity with which people went about cancelling Russia has ultimately exposed the type of thinking that seems to be dominant amongst those kind of people. I think in this respect, many Western intellectuals, or Atlanticist intellectuals perhaps to be more precise, have really overreached about this whole conflict with Russia. And one example is the distinguished American intellectual Anne Applebaum, who wrote a very good book about the Gulag, I think, but has also become something of a spokesperson for American national security policy in recent times. And she wrote an article in The Atlantic in May 2022 called "Why Ukraine Must Defeat Putin's Russia." Not only Putin, but Putin's Russia, in which she wrote, military loss could create a real opening for national self-examination or for a major change, as it so often has done in Russia's past. Only failure can persuade the Russians themselves to question the sense and purpose of a colonial ideology that has repeatedly impoverished and ruined their own economy and society, as well as those of their neighbours for decades. That from a representative of America criticising colonial ideology that has impoverished their own economy and society. Goodness me. And so there has been this overreach, this desire to engineer regime change in Russia, to strip Russia out of Western civilization and to project this sort of overwhelming dominance in whether the media, by cancelling Russian television stations or cancelling Russian artists, as well as on the battlefield and in the markets to crush Russia and to ultimately then break it up, to get it out of America's hair. And I feel ultimately this reflects the kind of cultural blinkers of the idea of Western civilization. It's a far too grandiose and self-absorbed viewpoint on the world, and ultimately one that helped drive the eastward expansion of NATO and bring on this war. And if Russia does win the war, then this self-regard will turn in on itself. Loss against Russia will perhaps, in Anne Applebaum's words, create a real opening for national self-examination or for a major change, not in Russia, but in America. We shall see. But certainly we can see that in, for example, the Global Times, the sort of Chinese Communist Party sort of based newspaper, there is a piece by Wang Yue and Liao Huan, which is sort of turning civilizational rhetoric against the West. On the 5th of May, they published an article called Russia-Ukraine Conflict Exposes Crisis of Western Civilization, in which they wrote, "It is conceivable that Western civilization will create conflict after conflict in the future because of its constant need for enemies, in particular under the logic of the disorderly expansion of capital and the worship of technology. The USA, with the DNA of Protestant fundamentalism and white supremacy, is shifting crises and creating contradictions instead of reforming itself and adapting to great changes unprecedented in a century by creating a narrative of democracy versus autocracy. A belligerent country, however big it may be, will perish. A civilization that lives by shaping foreign enemies and grows by dealing with them will eventually decline. This is a reality that we can see increasingly clearly when we observe the ongoing Russia-Ukraine conflict, as well as many wars that the US incited or participated in. I'm not endorsing those views. I'm quoting those views as, I guess, a example of how dangerous the rhetoric of civilization really is, but also, in a sense, how the Russia-Ukraine war has exposed the myths of the West and the liberal rules-based order. We can go all the way back to Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilization that in the 1990s reinvented a role for NATO, the Atlanticist alliance, in a conflict between orthodoxy, which should never really have been defined as a separate civilization, and Islam, a way of reinventing the Anglo-American war against Russia. And Russia has perhaps performed a judo flip on the West, outperforming the Ukrainian military, outsmarting the Western economic sanctions, outplaying the diplomatic game, and perhaps ultimately outlasting the culture and information war. Perhaps Russia has not so much fought World War III as it has begun the global war of independence against America. That would be a rich irony indeed. And that's where I guess I see the situation in Russia-Ukraine today. Very much a open situation, but one where I think we are rapidly moving into a very, very different world. I notice that I think later this week the Australian strategic policy thinker Hugh White is publishing a quarterly essay on Australia's unthinking alliance with America, and I may well comment on that essay here on the podcast. But I think next week what I'm going to do is I'm going to do my little bit to try to break down the negative rhetoric of clash of civilizations and the toxic effect of a cancel culture as applied to Russia. And I'm going to begin a bit of a series on Russian culture and Russian history, and begin by talking about 12 reasons why we should not cancel Russia. What are some of the gifts of Russian culture and history to us all of us people across the world? Until then, everyone, please remember to like and subscribe to the podcast, share it with your friends, and spread the word about the Burning Archive. And do remember that what thou lovest well will not be reft from thee. Bye now.